September 26, 1983. Serpukhov 15, a satellite early warning command bunker outside Moscow. After midnight, beneath concrete and earth, a long room breathes with machines, the hush of fans, the faint ticking of printers, the amber pulse of status lights lining steel racks. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov stares into the mint-green glow of a console that has become, in the new age of orbital warning, the most dangerous instrument on Earth. A red phone sits within easy reach. If the screens in front of him ever show the wrong pattern, and he relays the wrong words, the night will split open, and the world will not be the same when morning comes. He rubs at the bridge of his nose. It is the deep hour of tired men and old anxieties, and the bunker is damp with recirculated air. The shift runs like muscle memory, satellite feeds in one rack, tracking logic in another, the big projection board at the front with a stylized globe and arcs of possible flight paths. Around him, a handful of officers in earphones and tunics murmur call signs and times, annotating endless paper strips. Everything in its place, everything drilled. But the quiet tonight is brittle, as if the walls have learned to listen. Above ground, the Soviet Union is jumpy and sore. 3 weeks earlier, a civilian Boeing, Korean Airlines Flight 007, strayed into the wrong sky, and the air defense network tore it down near Sakhalin, killing 269 souls. The Kremlin has retreated behind its guard dogs and its grief, wary of ambush. Across the ocean, an evil empire speech swims through American newsreels, and Pershing 2 deployments inch closer to Soviet borders. NATO's war games grow sharper. The KGB's Global Watch, Operation Ryan, has ordered its officers to sniff out any hint of preemptive strike, down to spikes in hospital blood supplies and unusual nighttime lights in Western ministries. Everyone is seeing ghosts. The year 1983 feels like an echo of 1962, and in Moscow some men mutter darker dates. June 1941, when another enemy struck first while Soviet leaders slept. The fear is not just in speeches, it is in checklists and locks, and how quickly a hand might reach for a sealed codebook. Petrov keeps his eyes moving. The system is called OKO, the Eye, an orbital early warning net whose satellites ride steep Molniya orbits over dark hemispheres. Instead of staring straight down for the heat plume of a rising missile, they peer sideways toward the Earth's limb, where a hot contrail pops bright against black space. In theory, this geometry avoids the ordinary tricks of light and cloud. In theory, the horizon is clean. In practice, nothing that involves the sun is ever simple. Petrov knows this because he is not just an officer, but an engineer who has shepherded test data and written the kind of notes you only write when you don't entirely trust a machine. Tonight, OKO is their first line. The great over-the-horizon and early warning ground radars will not see anything until the mathematics of curvature permit. And by then, if the unthinkable is real, then is already too late. He glances at the duty roster: communications, plotting, telemetry, analysis. The men are good, trained. Some from villages, some from Moscow apartments, all of them with someone asleep somewhere, a wife, a mother, a child who will one day ask what he did in uniform. They joke in the slow periods, share cigarettes, complain about the chow. The human texture steadies him. It is easier to do this job if you're in love with ordinary life. 0015. A printer stutters and a dull bell chimes, the harmless language of a status update. Petrov notes it, says nothing. He has learned that command is attention, not fuss. He scratches a line in the log, checks the clock again. The clock in a room like this is an altar and a threat. Then the klaxon hits. It is not loud so much as decisive, a banshee wail that thinks on your behalf. Red panels burst awake, the overhead strobes spill a revolving bloodlight, and on the big map a tiny, hateful icon leaves America. The word flashes on Petrov's CRT launch. The computerized voice is clipped and merciless. One missile, North American interior. The calculated trajectory arcs toward Soviet soil like a drawn bow. The room jolts as chairs scrape and men lean in. Eyes go wider. No one speaks for an instant. Training catches up. A young operator calls range rate numbers. The telemetry officer reports a stable track. The comms position looks at Petrov with a question he does not voice. According to the book, this is the moment the duty officer reaches for the red phone to the general staff and names the thing out loud. According to the book, you do not editorialize, you report. The doctrine above doctrine, the one with skulls in the footnotes, is launch on warning. If the enemy fires, you fire back before your silos die. And in this season of suspicion, there is every chance that the men woken in Moscow will have only minutes to decide. Petrov can see it as if he were there. Andropov, gray-faced from illness and rage. The defense minister's mouth a hard line. The briefers rapid and afraid. The ancient fear of Barbarossa whispering behind the numbers. He inhales very slowly and does not pick up the phone. What is one missile supposed to accomplish? An opening blow of a world-ending attack would not be one. It would be a sky full of math. Revalidate, he says, voice level. Cross-check everything. The order is simple. The defiance extraordinary. A lieutenant at telemetry repeats, single launch indication. Confidence high. A plotting officer kneads his brow. Ground radars too early for confirmation, Comrade Colonel? They all know it. Those big dishes are blind to the first minutes of a shot from the Great Plains. The satellite is all they have right now. Petrov nods, but a second clock starts in his head, the one that measures how long you can wait before your caution becomes treason. He has drilled for chaos, but the first alarm is worse in silence. He can hear his own breath and the tiny scratch of pens against paper. In that air, a thought rises that is neither technical nor procedural. It makes no sense. The Americans are not fools. One missile is a provocation with no payoff. You don't poke a bear with a match, you bring a flamethrower. There's a reason the war colleges model salvo sizes in the hundreds. He lets the thought sit, and then the room tilts. The siren coughs again. A second launch splashes onto the screen, and before anyone can swear, a third. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. 5 tracks now, 5 arcs from the American interior, 5 pieces of bad news getting older by the second. The map looks suddenly like it has a disease. Men who were composed a minute ago have trouble keeping their hands still. This is it, someone whispers, not quite meaning anyone to hear. Petrov feels the animal part of the brain beg for the phone. 5 is not 1. 5 is something. He tastes copper, registers that his jaw has locked. Think. He raids his memory for everything the system designer said, but did not promise. The Oko constellation is new. It is early autumn. The sun is sliding low over the horizon relative to their line of sight. Under the wrong geometry, a high cloud bank can throw back a brightness that, for precious seconds, looks like a plume, a white lie of light. In testing, it had been a theoretical failure. Tonight, the theory may have found a stage. He asks the ground radar liaison again. Nothing yet. He asks for the exact spacing of the detections, the angular separation on the satellite's focal plane. The pattern doesn't look like a mass launch. It looks periodic, almost too neat. He hears his own teacher's voice in his head. If it's too clean, look for the artifact. He exhales and makes the call of his life. This is a false alarm. Do not transmit an attack report. That is an order. And because he must not sound like a man praying, he adds, I will sign. The communications officer swallows and keeps his headset on. A junior lieutenant begins to say, but, and reconsiders. What they need now is time, and time is exactly what a launch-on-warning posture denies you. Petrov buys it anyway, second by savage second. In the longest minutes of that night, all the theater of geopolitics, missiles in parades, threats in speeches, exercises with operatic names, shrinks down to heartbeats and luminous numbers. Out beyond the Urals, a radar crew drinks tea and watches empty air. In a Western European base, a crew chief curses a stubborn generator. In Washington, the president's staff draft lines about freedom that cannot help anyone here. In a Moscow apartment east of the river, a woman named Raisa turns in her sleep. The predicted first impact time for the first track arrives. Passes. No flash, no phone tree shattering the quiet. Another predicted time slides by, and the room's pulse, so carefully hidden under routine, begins to come down. At 9 minutes, an operator lets out a sound like a laugh, learning how to walk. At 10, the liaison from the ground station says flatly, "Still clear." Petrov nods, and only then notices his palms are slick where they grip the console. "It was nothing," someone says, then immediately looks embarrassed because the nothing had teeth. They reset. The OCO display returns to its steady watch. The duty log, like every war diary ever kept, exaggerates clarity by its very existence. Petrov directs that the malfunction be recorded as just that. Spurious launch indications, no corroboration. He understates his own role because he is not naive about hierarchies or the egos of men who bet careers on technology. Within the hour, he will stand in a room full of generals and scientists who would prefer a neat explanation that does not make them look foolish. The neat explanation is him, his missing entries in the heat of the moment, his deviation from protocol, anything but an expensive eye fooled by sunlight on clouds at the equinox. Weeks later, the engineers will concede precisely that. A rare alignment of sun, earth, and cloud tops had tripped the algorithm. After, the system would be updated to cross-reference geostationary views. An hour after the false 5, Petrov is summoned. The conference room is the color of old paper. 2 generals, an operations colonel, a civilian in a muted suit whose title is everyone's guess, and a couple of system designers with the tight smiles of men who have not slept. They listen while Petrov narrates, unsentimental and exact. He does not embroider. He does not hide that he chose not to report the attack indication. The silence at the end is colder than the bunker. A general coughs, says the obvious truth in a carved-from-stone tone. "In my opinion, your actions were correct." One of the engineers cuts in to ask why the duty journal is sparse for several minutes. The pivot from near apocalypse to paperwork is indecent and perfectly human. There will be no medal. Official victory here would require official shame elsewhere, and Soviet institutions have always preferred a clean table to a polished mirror. Petrov will keep his rank, keep his pay, and lose the one thing no bureaucracy can endure, the illusion that it could have done what he did. He will be reassigned gently later. He will tell no one. The incident will be buried under stamp and habit. In the logic of closed archives, the night will not have happened until years later a retired commander writes of it, and the world lets out a belated breath. He steps out into bleached dawn. The grass is wet, and for a moment the world looks almost eager about being spared. The road to Moscow is gray and ordinary. Buses take nurses to clinics, welders to yards, clerks to counters. Somewhere, a boy pedals a bicycle with a bent wheel. The peace of unknowing wraps the city like a second sky. He goes home the way men go home after long nights, down the corridor of small rituals, shoes off by the door, keys in the dish, a kettle on. He watches steam curl from the spout like a miniature missile and smiles at his own stupidity for the thought. He does not wake Raisa. He is not ready to translate the bunker into a kitchen. The story should end here, with a man who did his work and a sun that rose on schedule. The world prefers its providences anonymous. But 1983 is a year that refuses to be quiet. Earlier that month, the sky over Sakhalin had burned for Cal 007. In November, a NATO command post exercise called Able Archer 83 will dress so convincingly in the mannerisms of war, nuclear release procedures, silent escalations, that in Moscow there will be men who think for a few scorching days that the disguise may be a skin. Fighters will be loaded, warheads will be moved. Later, declassified papers will show how close the teachable moments came to teaching us nothing. The run-up includes KAL 007's dead, Reagan's rhetoric, SS-20s here, and Pershing's there, and an intelligence culture primed by Operation RYAN to see patterns even in ordinary weather. Petrov's night sits inside that larger storm like a dry match in a box next to a lit cigarette. He returns to duty because routine is the soldier's revenge on chance. The consoles do not apologize. The eye pretends it never blinked. The men who were with him that night treat him with the tact that soldiers reserve for miracles. They do not mention it outright, but they make room for him in doorways and offer cigarettes without asking. In the months that follow, someone decides his composure would be more comfortable away from first-line watch. His reassignment is presented as career development, which is how militaries describe anything they cannot explain. Years fall. The wall comes down somewhere else. The archives soften at their edges. In 1998, a retired general tells the tale. In 1999, the Washington Post runs the headline about a funny feeling in a gut and a man who didn't do what the siren told him. The BBC, then documentaries, then award committees, then the United Nations. The figure who stepped out of a gray Soviet dawn becomes the man who saved the world and is embarrassed by the phrase every time it lands at his feet. But the night itself, walk it slower, the way memory does. 0013. A shift lead glances at the velocity estimate and does the small math anyone with him could do. If the system is even close, a warhead would cross the pole and arrive within 20-odd minutes. He thinks of the doctrine, retaliate fast, survive by beating physics with fear, and something in him recoils. He has read enough history to know that systems built on panic will eventually instruct you to panic. He keeps that thought to himself because it is not the sort of thought that gets you promoted. 0014. The satellite label streaming at the bottom of the display is a family of letters and numbers that tells Petrov which eye saw the phantom. He pictures its orbit, its angle to the sun, the way the sensor's field of view chops through the upper atmosphere, how a cloud bank could stand exactly where the algorithm expects the hot speck of a booster's exhaust to appear. He wishes, fiercely and uselessly, that they had a synchronous bird in the constellation already, a second pair of eyes at a steadier angle, but those are still on the drawing boards. He writes nothing of this in the log because the log can't hold that kind of thinking. 0015. He asks for ground confirmation again, even though he knows the answer. The liaison's voice has a new burr in it, that bitter sawdust of men who understand they are ornamental at the moment they most want to be useful. The radars will not have line of sight until the tracks arc toward the far edge of their reach. If this were real, the whole structure of their defense would be an exercise in timekeeping. How many minutes until it is too late to do anything but be proud? 0016. The second launch indication turns the air thin. There is a show, put on perhaps for each other as much as for procedure, of additional checks. The operators are thorough men. Thoroughness is the substitute we invent for faith in machines. A sergeant from the comms position offers Petrov the phone, his own hand not quite steady enough to keep the tremor from the cradle. The gesture is an absolution in advance. Petrov thanks him and does not take it. Somewhere at the back of the bunker, a chair scrapes too loudly against concrete, and a corporal closes his eyes and opens them again, as if he could disbelieve sound. 0017, 3rd, 4th, 5th. Petrov sees the shapes on the map and feels utterly alone, which is the strangest part of command, that it is both crowded and solitary, full of voices and barren of company. He hears the sentence that will be the most quoted thing he never said, "I had a funny feeling in my gut," and mistrusts it. In truth, his gut is experience phrasing a Bayesian prior. He weighed frequencies and costs without moving his lips. He had read too many training summaries to believe a real attack would look like this. He knew too much about sensors to baptize first reports. He knew too much about men to escalate their fear. The future did not need his dramatics, it needed his math. 0018. He orders the sirens silenced, but not the display. The room's decibel level drops tenfold. The absence of the wail makes it possible to hear small sounds, a pen clicking, a shoe tapping, someone's breath failing to stay quiet. He says, in a voice he hopes will be remembered as plain, "This is a false alarm." He inserts exactly the right amount of steel into the next words, "No external notification." There is the smallest of pauses, the system taking that command and converting it to human action, and then the room becomes an imitation of normal, which is the bravest thing anyone can attempt. 0019 to 0030. The waiting begins. In these minutes, the world is like a coin tossed but not yet landed. No one outside this room knows it is spinning. Inside, they have only the one promise professionals can make themselves. We did the best thing for the most reasons. 0031. The coin hits the table and rolls away into the morning. After, the debriefs are as political as they are technical. The engineers outline how the satellites view the world, how their signal processors subtract earthshine and atmospheric noise, how the plume signature is supposed to be unambiguous. A physicist with tired eyes admits that the equinox can put the sun in a mischief-making posture relative to the satellite's sightline. They propose additional algorithms, tunings, cross-references to geostationary platforms, and more doctrinal reliance on ground confirmation before anybody moves a chess piece the size of Kansas. In other words, they propose to add time to a system designed to despise it. The generals murmur. No one wins points in a room like this for recommending patience. One senior officer, old enough to remember 1941 stagger, insists that their enemies are audacious, that 5 could be a decoy for 500, that faith in the enemy's rationality is a Western disease. Someone else mentions KAL-007, the way a string of small navigational errors collided with a fighter pilot's fear and doctrine and became newsprint stained with grief, and says that accidents in the sky do not argue for confidence. The words are not clear, but the terror behind them is, uncertainty is the true adversary. Good men can lose to it without firing a shot. In the official record, the incident does not exist. There is only a malfunction. There is only a corrective software patch. There is only the quiet transfer of one officer to a different desk. The country will not award a medal for disobeying instructions, even if obeying them would have killed the country. When the story finally gets out, some coverage will exaggerate his literal power, press this button mythologies. But that was never his authority. He could not launch anything. He could only trigger a process in which higher men, harsher, sicker, more frightened, would have maybe 10 minutes to rubber stamp annihilation. The miracle was not that he stopped a launch. It was that he stopped a conversation that would almost certainly have ended in one. He was born near Vladivostok in the first week of a war that would turn his homeland into a mausoleum and a myth. His father flew a fighter. His mother patched wounds. He grew up in the long shadow of victory, a boy taught to revere certain words, order, sacrifice, vigilance, until they became nearly abstract. He went to the Kiev Military Aviation Engineering Academy because he liked how machines made complicated things simple if you listened to them correctly. He chose air defense because someone had to mind the sky, and he suspected he was more patient than brave. He married Raisa. They had 2 children, Dmitri and Yelena. He learned that the surest way to be grateful for a state apartment is to watch your daughter sleep in it. He learned that a uniform is most impressive on a clothesline. He learned that there are kinds of pride that are quieter than flags. None of this appears in any personnel file. When he finally told the story in full, to Western journalists who wanted an emblem, and to Eastern colleagues who wanted an explanation, he tried to make it uglier and smaller so it could be understood. I followed common sense. The computer was wrong, but the world insisted on calling it heroism because we need the reassurance that heroism is available when we are not. He did not argue because arguing would not fix the machines or the doctrines. He took the plaques, the glass awards, the applause that embarrassed him. In 2004, a San Francisco-based group pressed a World Citizen Award into his shy hands. In 2006, he stood under the marble of the United Nations. In 2013, Dresden gave him a Peace Prize in a city that knows the price of fire from the air. He toured a decommissioned American missile site with the dry astonishment of a man meeting an enemy he had only known as math. Then he went home again. If you tell his story in a way that flatters us, it is a parable about the singular human who rescues a crowd. He stands between the herd and the cliff. He defies orders and history bends. But he always tried to tell it as a manual, not a myth. He wanted people to see the system that permitted the mistake and demanded the miracle, the geometry of sensors that could be fooled by the equinox, the pressure cooker doctrine that grants men 10 minutes to decide civilization's temperature, the institutional vanity that masks flaws instead of bleeding them out in daylight. On both sides of the world in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were false alarms that died out because someone had time, or nerve, or both. A training tape mislabeled at NORAD, a failed chip that cried wolf in Omaha. This is how narrow the ridge has always been. He ages into a man whose cardigan shoulders make you forget the uniforms in his closet. He cares for Raisa through a sickness that has its own sirens and stoic procedures. She dies in 1997. He speaks about her with the voice of a conscript assigned to pride, steady, short sentences, nothing lavish. He shrugs at cameras, smiles rarely, prefers to sit by a window. When asked, he will say there was no red button, that no one ever entrusted apocalypse to a single finger. There were layers and keys and rituals. Pressing anything was never his job. His job was to report, and the only thing he reported that night was the truth. There was nothing to report. To reconstruct what happened in those minutes is to reconstruct a hierarchy of doubt. First, doubt about the enemy's intentions. Would the Americans open with 5? Second, doubt about one's own machinery. Could the eye be tricked by light? Third, doubt about doctrine. Is there any world worth saving that demands you ruin it on a warning? These doubts are not glamorous. They do not make for parades. But they are the thin rope on which sober people cross between disaster and daylight. A historian assembling 1983 into a single word might choose misinterpretation. The Cal 007 tragedy, born of navigational error and hair trigger rules. Able Archer's rehearsal mistaken for a prelude. Satellites fooled by the world's oldest special effect, sunlight, polishing cloud tops over North Dakota. Leadership in both blocks, primed by ideology and memory, to read everything as preface. In that year, the gap between mistake and catastrophe narrowed as it had not since Cuban waters boiled under destroyer screws. That Petrov's choice sat right on that seam is not an accident. It is a diagnosis. He will die in 2017, and the news will take months to travel. A small, strange delay for a man whose most famous act was to insert the right delay into the deadliest feedback loop ever designed. Obituaries will strain to find an adjective that fits and will settle for the too small word calm. Calm is not the absence of fear. It is choreography in its presence. Calm is what says wait when alarms say run. Calm is what lets you separate signal from a machine's nightmare of itself. But before the afterlife of headlines and prizes, there was the work, and it was uglier than hero stories make it. In the hours before the alarm, he had reviewed stale telemetry until numbers blurred. He had signed off on test pings to make the ground crews feel less ornamental. He had reread a page in the manual that reminded him, with bureaucratic cruelty, that he was a node in a chain and not a thinker. He had folded that page back on itself by instinct, and not because he planned to defy anything. The irony of such systems is that they rely on people precisely because people can defy them when they most need defying, yet they train people to forget how. He had drawn a little rectangle in the margin of his logbook where the word launch would later land, as if his hand, like an old midwife, had made a place for the baby before it came. When it came red and loud and entirely without pity. The room filled with the sound every designer says is neutral and everybody hears as a threat. It is important to know that even men who have practiced for years are not practiced for the first second after the first alarm. In that first second, training steps aside and something older stands up, something that remembers tigers. What saved them was not courage. Courage is for running toward things. What saved them was stubbornness, a farmer's refusal to harvest clouds. He looked at 5 immaculate arcs and said, in effect, prove it. This is not the sentence of a hero, it is the sentence of an auditor. Which is what you want at the hinge of the world, not a poet, not a hawk, but a clerk with a suspicious mind. He did something else that mattered. He protected his subordinates from the gravity of his decision. He took the heat and the signature line. It is always tempting to dilute responsibility, we decided, we agreed, but dilution is not a shield, it is a solvent. He held the line and told the line to hold. And so when later a commission asked why the duty journal was thin, right where the heart beats hardest, the truth was indecent. Writing is a luxury in a room where a man is deciding whether the sun comes up. He accepted the reprimand because it was the cheapest currency available to buy the secret back from shame. Zoom out again, because the hinge is only meaningful if you see the door it turns. On the American side, 4 years before Petrov's night, a training tape had been fed into a machine at NORAD, and through the kind of mysticism only computers can do, its monsters escaped the lab and appeared on operational screens. In 1980, a failed computer chip persuaded SAC for tense minutes that oceans were boiling with missiles. In both cases, human skepticism, cross-checks, and time prevented the worst. These episodes were not a reason to mock machines. They were a reason to distrust the theater of immediacy. Any doctrine that demands you act faster than you can think will eventually ask you to act instead of thinking. On the Soviet side in 1983, Operation Ryan had turned embassies into seismographs for rumors. The KGB's periodic cables, later pried loose by historians, read with the urgency of men sure a storm is already aboard. Blood bank inventories, lights burning late at defense ministries, exercises with names sharp enough to cut. Any tremor might be the first shiver of the mountain. By the week of Able Archer, those tremors sang like a choir. It is no conspiracy to say the Kremlin was afraid. It is the whole point. Fear is the most rational emotion in a nuclear age, and the most dangerous to empower. He used fear properly. He let it warn and not rule. He let it notice and not narrate. He let it stand beside him, but not take his chair. The difference between those uses is measured in cities. And yet, for all the drama, the most unsettling truth is this: nothing happened. No missiles flew. No radar painted the sky with approaching metal. No phone screamed in Moscow apartments. The system coughed up 5 lies. A man refused to repeat them. Morning came. Bakery doors rose. Trams sparked. The invisibility of the saved disaster is the true insult to men like him. It leaves no crater to point at, no medals to pin beside a scar. It leaves only the ordinary day, as if that were free. He did not think of himself as brave. He thought of himself as lucky, lucky that the pattern was wrong enough to be doubted, lucky that the room trusted him long enough to be right, lucky that the ground radars stayed quiet long enough to prove a negative. He would say later that he simply did his job. He meant it. Which is perhaps why strangers loved him, because if doing the job can save the world, then the world might yet be saved by people like us, who bring our lunch and our suspicion to work. He did not keep souvenirs, he kept habits. The way he checked a stove twice, the way he stood a moment longer than needed at a window, the way his hand hovered over a switch before committing. He would tell interviewers in a soft, dry way that machines were only as trustworthy as the time you allowed them to be checked by other machines and other men. He said this without bitterness. He had no quarrel with computers and every quarrel with haste. In later years, another false alarm would startle the Kremlin, a Norwegian research rocket mistaken for a terrible handful of minutes in 1995 for an incoming Trident. That incident ended in nothing too, because it found enough minutes to die in. Notice the pattern. Good endings are measured in minutes. Bad ones, had we lived to label them, would have been measured in seconds. His gift to us, if you need a name for it, was minutes. Give institutions the tools to buy them. He died quietly in May 2017. Months later, the news filtered west. A few obituaries tried to supply the adjectives he had refused in life: humble, stoic, decisive, reluctant, ordinary. Ordinary may be the best of them. We tell ourselves civilization is held up by giants and geniuses. Most days it is held up by ordinary men and women who refuse to hurry, when hurrying is what kills. Back to the room, because the style demands it. The siren ends. The light stops turning. The map returns to its patience. A man puts his hand flat on a warm console and feels how alive the machinery is, how ready to act, how ready to mislead, how ready to be believed. He writes 3 words in a book that will be misfiled on purpose: false alarm confirmed. He straightens the papers at his station and finds, in the chaos, a pencil he does not own. He leaves it where it is, as if to mark the spot where fear did not win. The relief arrives not as triumph, but as a sudden appetite. He will eat something greasy and tasteless at the canteen and think it is the best food since childhood. He will walk out into a morning that had no right to be ordinary and notice a sparrow doing bureaucratic work on a puddle. He will go home and sit in a chair and listen to his wife breathe, and will not tell her why he is smiling like a fool. He will not sleep. In offices above his head, there will be men already shaping meetings where the incident will be rendered back into parts. Sensor error, software fix, personnel counseling, procedural reminder. They will succeed in making the night look solvable. This is their job. It is not his job to believe them. And somewhere, on the other side of the planet, a child is learning how to whistle through missing teeth, and a dog is barking at a mailman, and a woman is deciding whether today is the day she will quit and find a different life. The world goes about its cowardly business of surviving without thanking anyone. This, too, is correct. If we had to stop and say thank you every time an invisible disaster failed to happen, we would never do anything else. So remember it this way, if you must remember. A red word on a green screen, 5 little arcs that were only light on cloud, a man who waited when the world asked him not to, and a morning that looked exactly like every other morning because he did. Addendum: the wider storm that made his minutes matter. The year's first act had opened with slogans and deployments. In Europe, the SS-20 pioneers squatted in forest hides, triple warhead messages pointed west. In response, NATO pressed toward fielding Pershing II, promising shorter flight times and harder dilemmas for Soviet planners. The American president's March speech filleted ideology into television. Evil empire and simplicity always travels faster than nuance. By summer, the mechanics of deterrence, the routines meant to be boring, began to hum at uncomfortable frequencies. On September 1st, Cal 007 bled its way across the wrong lines and into the wrong doctrine. The wreckage lay in cold water, while governments rehearsed blame. Inside Lubyanka and Yasenevo, memos multiplied. Ryan asked case officers to count the number of cars in Pentagon parking lots, to peek at lights after hours, to watch for blood drives, indices of a strike written in the confidence of men who have once been surprised and vowed never again. And in autumn's last act, Able Archer dressed itself in harder masks than usual. New codes, more realistic silent hours, nuclear release drills, with radio discipline and DEFCON theater done too well for the season. The Soviets' western military districts rustled with movement felt by antennas, but not admitted by press releases. Had Petrov decided differently, had Moscow taken the bait of its own machines and alarm, the month of September could have become an obituary for November's restraint. The hinge would have turned the wrong way. You want dates? The civilian Boeing fell on September 1, 1983, all 269 aboard lost. Petrov's night was September 26th, a Tuesday by the West's calendars. Able Archer ran November 7th to 11th. In between were speeches, funerals, and silences that did no work. Place these pins on a map, then draw a trembling line through them. That is the shape of the year. The technology matters because the temptation is always to blame the human alone, his nerve, his luck. The Molniya orbit that gave Oko its vantage also gave the sun a weapon. At certain latitudes and seasons, the satellite looks along the day-night terminator. High cloud tops flare like match heads. The processing chain is supposed to be ruthless. Discriminate a booster's heat signature from harmless glare, filter the noise, print a verdict. But a verdict is only as good as the court, and on that night the court's rules were not ready for autumn. Petrov's doubt did not cancel the physics, it outweighed them. Later, the fix came. Better algorithms, better cross-checks, a geostationary peer to call, "Are you seeing this too?" The lesson is not that machines lie, it is that they tell the truth poorly when asked the wrong question too quickly. You want doctrine? Launch on warning is a love letter to speed. It believes you can see clearly enough, quickly enough, to murder certainty's absence with certainty's performance. It is not evil, it is frightened. It is built out of a memory of first strikes and a fantasy that automation will keep courage from becoming hesitation. Petrov's refusal was not a rebellion against the state, it was a rebellion against the schedule. And the ledger of close calls does not stop with him. Somewhere in an American bunker in 1979, a training tape masqueraded as reality. In 1980, a single chip spat defects that looked like death. In 1995, a Norwegian rocket filed all the right notices and still appeared to Russian screens like a spear. Each time, translation, time into judgment, saved us. The hour was not yet built that could remove the clerk and the colonel from the loop and still deserve the name civilization. What do you make of a man who calls himself unheroic? Perhaps you say that the world is safest when the heroes are reluctant, and the reluctant are in charge of clocks. Perhaps you say that the name on the plaque matters less than the diagram in the manual, the one that adds 3 boxes to the flowchart labeled Wait, Verify, Ask Again. Perhaps you write, as someone will write when the archives are dull and the camera's gone, that the man in the chair at Serpukhov 15 did not save the world. He permitted it to save itself by declining to end it on the authority of a blinking word. The siren is silent. The map is patient. The chair is empty. The morning looks like any other morning. That is the miracle. And because the style demands it, we stop here, where the paper says, false alarm confirmed, and the day, which owes us nothing, pays us back in bread lines and school bells and puddles arguing with sparrows,